The MAZ-543 came to rest at an angle no road would explain. Its 8 tires gone to ash, the launch rail twisted upward like something caught mid-scream. Western Iraq, somewhere south of the Jordanian border, in a stretch of desert that had no name worth printing on a map. A reconnaissance crew photographed it days later. The vehicle weighed 37,000 kilograms loaded, a Soviet-built monster designed to haul a single ballistic missile across open ground and disappear before anyone could do anything about it. That was the whole idea behind it. Disappear. This one hadn't. If you've ever stood next to a piece of wreckage and felt the story still warm in the metal, that's the kind of thing this channel is built on. So drop what you know in the comments, hit subscribe, and like the video so the next person who needs to find it can. The after-action photographs show scorch patterns that radiate outward from a point above and behind the cab, not a ground explosion. Something arrived from the air at a steep angle, in the dark, and it knew exactly where the truck was. The Iraqis called these launch teams the proudest job in Saddam's rocket forces. They trained to a Soviet manual that promised survival through movement. Set up in under an hour, fire, fold the rail, drive into the night, and let the desert swallow you. For roughly 40 years, that doctrine held against every air force on Earth, because finding a moving truck in the dark over thousands of square miles of nothing was, by any reasonable math, impossible. Then came 1991. The thing about the doctrine is that it assumed the night was a hiding place. It assumed that darkness subtracted the enemy's eyes the same way it subtracted yours. Soviet planners wrote that assumption into every page, and the Iraqis inherited it whole. The way you inherit a house and never check whether the wiring still works. The wiring did not still work. An American 2-seat fighter bomber had arrived in theater carrying a pod that turned black desert into gray daylight, and the men who flew it could read a license plate from altitude at 3 in the morning. The crews on the ground had no way to know that. They drove into the dark believing the dark belonged to them. The strike that killed this particular launcher left almost no record of itself. The unit logs from that week in the Scud hunting campaign are thin, and some of what was written stays sealed in archives that the Air Force has not seen fit to open. Someone decided the details of how American air crews found and killed mobile launchers in real time was worth keeping quiet. And 30 years on, parts of it still are. What survives is the wreckage and the photographs. A burned MAZ chassis, a launch rail bent past use, and a crater placement so precise that the analyst who wrote it up reached for a single word. The assessment calls the accuracy surgical. Their word, not mine. The question that wreckage asks is simple, and the rest of this is the answer. How did a generation of Iraqi rocketeers, trained by the Soviets to own the night, end up burning in it instead? 2:40 a.m., January 18, 1991. The first Scud of the war crossed into Israeli airspace while most of Tel Aviv slept, and the explosions that followed did something no Iraqi general had managed in any briefing room. They rewrote the coalition's war plan overnight. Saddam had fired 7 or 8 missiles. Sources disagree on the exact count that first night, at a country that was not even part of the fight. The warheads carried conventional explosive, not the chemical agents everyone feared, but that distinction meant nothing to a population pulling on gas masks in stairwells. Israel began preparing to retaliate, and retaliation by Israel would have shattered the fragile Arab partnership holding the coalition together. Saddam understood this perfectly. The Scud was a terrible weapon by any military measure, wildly inaccurate, capable of landing a half-mile from anything it aimed at. But he had found the one target it could hit without aiming. The alliance itself. This is where the obsession started, and it ran straight up the chain. The story everyone tells is that Washington begged Israel to stand down and promised to solve the Scud problem in exchange. The part that gets less attention is how thin the cupboard was when the order came down. The coalition had planned to spend roughly 2% of its air effort hunting mobile launchers. Within days, that figure climbed past 30% on some nights, and there is a memo, declassified years later and reproduced in the Gulf War Air Power Survey, that lays the panic out in plain bureaucratic language. The survey was commissioned by the Air Force itself and ran to several thousand pages across multiple volumes, the kind of document that gets compiled, printed in tiny numbers, and quietly shelved. A researcher digging through the third volume finds the assessment of the Scud hunt buried among tanker schedules and sortie counts, almost as if someone hoped it would be read by no one. The line that survives reads, "The Scud hunt diverted a major portion of the air campaign from objectives of considerably greater military value." That is the official verdict on chasing trucks across the desert. A waste of effort, militarily speaking, forced by politics. All of it traced back to that 2:40 a.m. So, what did the planners actually have to work with? Strategically, almost nothing. The Iraqis fielded perhaps 200 mobile launchers, some real Soviet-built MAZ transporters, and some homemade decoys welded together to look right on radar and infrared. And they operated out of two broad regions, the western desert facing Israel and the southeast facing the Saudi cities and the troop concentrations near the Gulf. Daylight reconnaissance found empty firing positions, scorch marks, where a launcher had been an hour earlier. The cold print of a vehicle that had already folded its rail and driven off. The hunters were always arriving at a party that had ended. Coalition aircraft flew thousands of sorties against suspected Scud sites during the war and could confirm almost none of them as kills, a number the survey itself treats with open skepticism. The Iraqi crews were doing exactly what the Soviet manual told them to do, and against satellites and high-altitude reconnaissance and conventional strike packages, the manual still worked. It had worked for 40 years. The men driving those trucks at 3 in the morning had every statistical reason to believe it would keep working, because the math of finding a moving vehicle in the dark across the western desert had not changed since the doctrine was written. What had changed was sitting on a ramp in Saudi Arabia, 2 crewmen to an airframe, waiting for the sun to go down. The Iraqis did not know it was there. They were about to find out. 29,000 square miles. That is the rough size of the western desert box the coalition had to police for launchers, an area larger than West Virginia. Most of it flat brown, nothing under a sky that went black at night and stayed black. Put 200 trucks into that box, let them move at will, and ask an aircraft to find one. The geometry alone defeats you before the enemy does. A Scud needed maybe an hour to set up, fire, and fold, and a launcher could be 10 miles from its firing point before the missile finished its arc. The hunters knew where the rocket had come from. They almost never knew where the truck had gone. The sortie numbers tell the same story from the other end. Coalition aircraft flew somewhere around 2,500 sorties against mobile Scud targets over the course of the war, and the Gulf War Air Power Survey, going back through the strike claims afterward, could not confirm a single destruction of a mobile launcher by air attack. Not one. The pilots reported kills in good faith, dozens of them, and the analysts who reviewed the gun camera footage found burning fuel trucks, burning decoys, burning tanker rigs that read hot and bright on infrared and turned out to be the wrong shape entirely. The Iraqis figured this out fast and built the confusion into their plan. A flatbed with some pipe and a propane tank welded on cost almost nothing and pulled a strike package off a real launcher just as well as the genuine article. Daylight made it worse, not better. You would think the sun helped, and for finding things it did. But a launcher crew that survived the night simply parked under a highway overpass or inside a culvert or beside a civilian building and waited the daylight out. The reconnaissance flights came over and photographed empty road. By the time the film was developed, screened, plotted, and turned into a target package, the window was gone and the crew was moving again. The intelligence cycle ran in hours, the launchers ran in minutes. That mismatch is the whole problem in one sentence, and no amount of sortie volume closed it. So, the math sat there, ugly and unmoved. 200 launchers, real and fake, scattered across tens of thousands of square miles, each one needing roughly an hour of vulnerability to do its job, and then vanishing into a desert that offered 1,000 places to disappear. The coalition was throwing nearly a third of its nightly air effort at a target set it could not reliably locate, let alone hit, and the bombs were finding decoys. Every metric pointed to failure. The crews on the ground read those same metrics. In their own way, every time they drove home intact at dawn and brewed tea and slept through the heat. The doctrine was holding. The numbers said so. What the numbers could not account for was an aircraft built to ignore the dark, and it was already flying. So why did the dark stop working? The honest answer starts in Moscow, decades before the war, in the rooms where Soviet air defense planners built their model of the night. Their assumption was symmetrical, and that was the flaw. They reasoned that an enemy pilot at night saw roughly what their own pilots saw, which was very little: a black ground passing under a black sky, the occasional light, nothing a bomb sight could use. Build your doctrine around that symmetry, and movement becomes salvation. The launcher fires, the rail folds, the truck rolls into terrain the enemy cannot read, and by sunrise it is 40 kilometers away under a tarp. This held against the strategic bombers of the 1950s, against the fighter bombers of Vietnam, against everything the Israelis flew in 1973. 40 years of evidence said the symmetry was real. The Iraqis trained to it because the men who taught them had trained to it, and nobody in that chain had any reason to ask whether the Americans had quietly broken the symmetry. The thing about an inherited assumption is that it gets harder to question the longer it pays off, and this one had been paying off since before most of the Scud crews were born. The break came from a piece of equipment the crews never saw and could not have imagined from the ground. Forward-looking infrared does not need light. It reads heat, the difference in temperature between a diesel engine and the sand around it, between rubber tires that have been rolling for an hour and the cold desert at 3 in the morning, and it renders that difference as a picture a human eye can use. MAZ-543 Transporter is a 37,000-kilogram machine with a multi-liter diesel power plant, and after a road march it glows on infrared like a coal in a dark room. The crew sees nothing. They have done everything the manual demands, killed their lights, moved under cover of a moonless night, put distance between themselves and the firing point, and every one of those measures is calibrated against a threat that sees invisible light. Against a sensor that sees in heat, every one of them is useless. Worse than useless, because the very act of driving, of running the engine to escape, is what lights them up. The doctrine that promised survival through movement had been quietly inverted. Movement was now the signature. I find that the cruelest part of the whole story, that the single action the manual treated as salvation, was the action that drew the bomb. They were taught to run, and running is what got them seen. Then there is the matter of who was looking and from where. An aircraft orbiting at 20,000 feet with a stabilized infrared pod could scan a stretch of highway and pick a hot vehicle out of cold terrain in real time. No film to develop, no analyst to wake, no target package to route through 3 headquarters. The sensor saw it, the crew in the cockpit saw what the sensor saw, and the weapon to act on it hung under the wing. The intelligence cycle that had run in hours collapsed into the span of a single orbit. The Iraqi math left that variable out, because the math had been written when finding and striking were 2 separate problems separated by time, and the time was where launchers lived. Close that gap, and the launcher has nowhere to live. The crews could not adjust, because adjustment requires knowing what you are adjusting to, and nothing in their training, their equipment, or their experience told them the night had a new tenant. They went on driving into the dark exactly as instructed. The dark, for the first time in the doctrine's life, was no longer empty. It held an aircraft that treated 3 in the morning as a working condition rather than an obstacle. Crewed by 2 men who could see the engine block glowing through the windscreen of a truck that thought it had vanished. So the protection darkness offered was never a property of darkness. It was a property of the sensors pointed into it, and the moment one of those sensors changed, the protection evaporated without anyone on the ground feeling the floor shift. The Iraqi crews still believed in the night because the night still looked the same to them. Their eyes told them they were hidden. The manual told them they were safe. Both were describing a world that had stopped existing the week the American fighter bombers arrived in theater, and the gap between what the crews believed and what was now true is the space where the next part of this happens. We owned the night. That was how F-15E crews described their war, and it was not bravado, it was a specification. The Strike Eagle had not wandered into the Scud hunt by accident. McDonnell Douglas had taken the air superiority F-15, the clean, fast interceptor built to win dogfights, and rebuilt it into something the original never was, a two-seat, all-weather striker with a rear cockpit full of screens and a backseater whose entire job was finding things on the ground and putting bombs on them. The front seater flew and fought the airplane. The weapons systems officer ran the sensors. Two sets of eyes, two workloads split clean down the middle, and that division of labor mattered more at 3 in the morning than any single piece of hardware bolted to the jet. The hardware that made the difference hung in 2 pods under the intakes, and it had a name that sounded like a committee invented it, because one did. LANTIRN. Low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night. The navigation pod carried a wide-field, forward-looking infrared and a terrain-following radar, which let the aircraft fly fast and low in pitch dark, hugging the ground at heights that would terrify a pilot relying on his eyes. The targeting pod carried a narrower, sharper infrared and a laser. One pod got you there at 200 feet in the black. The other found the truck and guided the bomb. Together they turned a moonless desert from a problem into a working environment, and the men flying it stopped thinking of darkness as something to survive and started thinking of it as cover. Run the comparison the Iraqis never got to run. A launcher crew drives at night because the manual says the dark hides them, and on the ground, to a human eye, it does. Overhead, an F-15E is reading their diesel engine as a bright smear on a green screen, the terrain-following radar holding the jet steady at altitude. The backseater walking the targeting pod across the highway until the hot shape resolves into a vehicle, and then into a vehicle worth a bomb. The crew below sees nothing, hears nothing until the last seconds. There is no warning radar to trip because infrared is passive, it emits nothing, it only receives. The truck cannot detect the sensor that has already found it. I think that asymmetry is the whole war compressed into a single engagement, one side blind and certain, the other watching and quiet. The weapon itself was usually a laser-guided bomb, a GBU-12 in most cases, a 500-pound bomb with a seeker head that rode the laser spot the backseater held on the target. Drop it, keep the pod steady, let the bomb fly itself down the beam. Against a stationary launcher, it was nearly unmissable. Against a moving one, the crews learned to wait, watching the truck stop and catching it in the minutes it sat, exposed, setting up to fire or breaking down to run. That, waiting, is where the kills came from, and it required an aircraft that could loiter in the dark over hostile ground for as long as the fuel held. The F-15E could. The question was whether anyone would point it at the right stretch of desert at the right hour. 0340 hours. A logged orbit somewhere over the western desert. That is the kind of timestamp that survives in a mission record long after the men who filled it have scattered to other careers. A 4-digit mark that means a weapons systems officer was awake and working while a truck crew 30,000 feet below thought the world was asleep. What the thermal picture showed at that hour was not a truck. It was a temperature map, and the map told stories the human eye was never built to read. A diesel engine that had been turning over for an hour sat at a different temperature than the cab around it. The tires, 8 of them on a MAZ-543, held the friction heat of the road march and glowed in a ring against the cold pan of the desert floor. Even a recently vacated parking spot left a thermal shadow, a patch of ground warmed by an engine block that had idled there and then pulled away. Infrared does not forget that fast. The vehicles were warm and the desert was cold, and that was all the contrast we needed. That line, attributed in the after-action material to an F-15E weapons systems officer, gets at the cruelty of the physics better than any specification sheet. Contrast was the whole game. The targeting pod did not need a clear shape or a recognizable silhouette. It needed a temperature difference, and the high desert at 3 in the morning delivered that difference for free. Sand sheds its heat fast once the sun is gone, dropping toward freezing while the machinery on top of it stayed warm from work. A launcher crew running its engine to relocate after a firing was generating exactly the signal the pod was tuned to find. And the harder they ran, the brighter they burned. A cold engine helped them. A crew that shut down and sat still for hours in the open had a fighting chance of fading into the background temperature. But a launcher exists to move and fire, and movement meant heat, and heat meant a bright smear walking across a backseater's screen with nowhere on that screen to hide. The death sentence was written in that gap between what the crew controlled and what they did not. They could kill their lights, and they did. They could choose moonless nights, and they did. They could not turn off the laws of thermodynamics, and nobody had ever told them they would need to. So the backseater watched a hot vehicle crawl along a highway and waited, because a moving truck at speed is a harder thing to guide a bomb onto than a stopped one. And the discipline of the hunt was patience. The pod held. The vehicle slowed, pulled off the road, began the unhurried business of setting up to launch or breaking down to leave, and in those minutes it sat motionless and radiant against a freezing desert. That was the window. The laser went active. The spot settled on the warmest part of the target. The GBU-12 came off the rail and rode the beam down through air the crew could not see through, to ground the crew thought was empty. Below, the first warning was sound, and sound arrives late. By the time a man heard anything, the geometry was already finished. A 37,000-kilogram transporter that had spent 40 years of doctrine learning how to disappear into darkness had been reduced by a sensor that read warmth instead of light to the brightest object for miles. The night that was supposed to hide them was the thing holding them up against the cold, and they never knew the difference until it stopped mattering. The backseater had the truck for 11 minutes before the bomb came off. That is a long time to watch a man you are about to kill. Longer than the engagement itself, longer than the fall of the weapon, and it is the part of the kill chain that nobody who has not done it quite believes. Detection came first, a worm shape sliding along a highway the planners had marked as a Scud corridor. Then identification, the slow resolving of smear into vehicle worth a bomb, the backseater leaning into the pod imagery while the pilot held the orbit and burned fuel in a lazy circle 200 miles from anything friendly. The hunt was not a pounce, it was a stalk, and the patience belonged to the side that could afford it. What ground the Iraqis down was not any single strike. It was the accumulation, night after night, of a math that had inverted on them without warning. Every relocation generated heat. Every firing lit a beacon visible from horizon to horizon on a sensor they did not know existed. A crew that survived one night learned the wrong lesson from it, that the doctrine still worked, that the dark still held, and they drove out again the next night carrying the same false confidence into the same waiting orbit. The records of who killed what get murky here, and that murk is itself a piece of history. After the war, the coalition claimed dozens of mobile launchers destroyed, and a post-war Air Force survey went back through the gun camera footage and the strike reports and concluded that many of those claims could not be confirmed, that some of the kills were decoys, fuel trucks, or shapes that read hot and turned out to be nothing. The number the crews believed and the number the analysts could verify were not the same number, and the gap between them stayed in argument for years. The Gulf War Air Power Survey, commissioned by the Air Force and published in 1993, is where most of that reckoning lives. Thousands of pages assembled because someone decided the difference between claimed and confirmed was worth preserving honestly. Reading it, you get the sense of analysts who admired the airmen and still refused to sign off on the tally, and that tension is the most useful thing in the document. Which brings us back to the 11 minutes over the highway, where none of that post-war arithmetic mattered yet. The release was almost anticlimactic after the wait. Truck slows, pulls off the road, the crew below climbing down to do the work the launcher exists for. The laser goes active. The GBU-12 drops, rides the spot down, and the backseater holds the pod steady through the fall because the bomb is only as good as the hand keeping the beam on the target. Then the flash on the screen, white blooming where the warm shape had been, and the pilot rolls out of the orbit toward the tanker track. Below, a column of Iraqi rocketeers learns what the night has become. The aircraft is already gone, climbing back into the dark it never feared, looking for the next warm thing on a cold highway. The cockpit at altitude was a quiet place, mostly fan noise and the hiss of the regulator with each breath. The green wash of the pod display the brightest thing in either man's world. Outside the canopy, the desert gave back nothing, a black floor under a black sky with the horizon erased. Down there, a launcher crew had done everything the manual asked. Lights off, engine cut. The MAZ-543 sat in a wadi with a tarp thrown over the rail. The crew of 4 crouched in the cold beside it, waiting out the dark the way Soviet doctrine promised would keep them alive. To their eyes, the night was total, and the sky was empty. They had hidden the truck. They could not hide that the truck had been driven. On the pod, the engine block still burned. The crew had killed it 20 minutes earlier, and the cast iron held its heat the way cast iron does, a soft glow bleeding through the tarp like a coal under a blanket, and the 8 tires sat in their warm ring against ground that had already dropped toward freezing.
The backseater did not see a hidden launcher. He saw a smear that had no business being warm in a place that should have been uniform cold, and he leaned into it and let the shape resolve. Vehicle. Then vehicle worth a bomb. The pilot rolled the orbit tighter. Nobody said much because there was nothing to decide. The decision had been made 40 years earlier in a Moscow planning room that never imagined a sensor reading warmth instead of light. The laser went active, and the spot settled on the warmest part of the smear.
The GBU-12 came off the rail and the airframe lifted as the weight left it, and for the seconds of the fall, the only job in the universe was holding the pod steady on a tarp over a cooling engine. Below, the crew heard nothing. Sound arrives late, and a bomb gliding down a beam makes no sound at all until the last half second, when it makes the only sound that matters. The screen went white. The tarp, the rail, the cast iron that gave them away, the 4 men who had done everything right except drive a hot machine across cold ground, all of it bloomed and was gone. The dark they trusted had been holding them up against the cold the entire time, a lit candle on a black table, and they died believing they were hidden. You can put a 500-pound bomb through a window from 15,000 feet, and the guy inside never hears the airplane. That is a paraphrase that floated around the F-15E community after the war, and the men who said it were not exaggerating the window so much as describing the arithmetic that made the window possible. Take the GBU-12 apart, and the math stops being a boast. The bomb starts as a Mark 82 general-purpose body, 500 pounds nominal, about 192 pounds of it tritonal explosive packed in a steel case built to fragment. Bolt a laser seeker on the nose and a set of pop-out fins on the tail, and you have turned a piece of falling iron into something that corrects its own errors all the way and down. The crew did not have to be over the target. They had to be within a basket, and the basket was enormous. The numbers turned lethal at this point, quietly, the way they always do in this story. An F-15E orbiting at 20,000 feet, releasing a GBU-12 in a shallow dive, could put that bomb on a target slack miles downrange of the release point, because the weapon traded its forward speed and its falling height into a glide that the seeker steered. The crew could stand off well outside the range of anything the launcher site carried for self-defense, and the launcher carried almost nothing for self-defense. A Scud transporter is a truck with a missile on it. It has no radar, no gun worth the name, no way to shoot back at a shape it cannot see or hear, and the aircraft killing it sat far enough away and high enough up that the engagement was less a fight than a transaction. One side had a sensor and a beam and a falling bomb. The other side had a tarp and a cooling engine and 40 years of doctrine that assumed the first side did not exist. Run the lethal radius against the target, and the outcome stops being a question. AMAZ-543 is a long vehicle, roughly 42 feet from bumper to rail, and 192 pounds of tritonal does not need a bullseye to finish a truck that size. Circular error probable for a laser-guided bomb in good conditions ran to a few feet, which means the bomb was not trying to land near the launcher, it was trying to land on it, and it usually did. A near miss by the standards of an unguided bomb was a direct hit by the standards of this one. The fragmentation pattern alone would shred the hydraulics, the fuel, the crew, the missile sitting on the rail waiting to fly. There was no version of the geometry where a 500-pound guided bomb arrived within a few feet of a fueled transporter, and the transporter survived. The energy did not allow it, so the night the math turned lethal was not a single night. It was the moment repeated across the western desert through the winter of 1991, when every variable lined up on the American side of the ledger and stayed there. Standoff range beat self-defense range. Sensor resolution beat camouflage discipline. Bomb accuracy beat the size of the target. Every one of those was a number, and every number favored the aircraft, and the Iraqi crew had no number of their own to put against them. Darkness they had, but darkness had been demoted from a shield to a backdrop. They had dispersion, and dispersion only worked if the hunter could not find the dispersed. Speed in the relocation they had too, and that speed generated the very heat the hunter was tuned to read. The cruel part, the part that I think the surviving crews never fully understood, is that none of it was a fair fight, and none of it was supposed to be. Air power done right is not a duel. It is the systematic application of advantages the other side cannot answer, and the F-15E over the Scud boxes was air power done close to right. A truck crew trained to beat searchlights and night vision, and the human eye walked out under a sensor that beat all three at once, carried a missile to a launch point, and became 192 pounds of someone else's explosive looking for 192 pounds of warm steel to meet. The numbers had already decided. The crew just had not been told. What does a man do when the thing he was trained to trust turns out to be the thing killing him? The Iraqi launcher crews answered that question with their feet. By the second week of the campaign, the Western Desert had taught them a lesson their manuals never contained. And the lesson was not tactical. It was something closer to dread. Captured crewmen described it to coalition interrogators after the war, and the assessments that came out of those debriefs are blunt about what the men had become. One report summarizes it plainly. Crews became reluctant to launch, fearing that firing would bring immediate retaliation from aircraft they could neither see nor hear. The operative word there is fearing, because fear was the weapon that worked after the bombs had done their teaching. The launchers still functioned. The missiles still flew, when someone could be made to fire them. What had broken was the willingness to do the job at all. Walk it back to the firing sequence, and you can see exactly where the dread lived. A Scud launch is loud and bright and slow, a pillar of flame standing up off the rail for the long seconds it takes the missile to climb. And during those seconds, the crew is the most visible object in a province. They knew by February what the flash meant. It meant a backseater somewhere overhead had just watched a star be born on his pod and was already rolling his orbit toward it. So the crews started cutting corners on the doctrine that was supposed to keep them alive, shaving setup time, skipping the careful survey, firing on bad alignment, and running before the missile had cleared, which is part of why so many of the later Scuds tumbled and missed and came down on empty ground. The Soviets had built a launch ritual around precision. The Americans had turned precision into a death sentence, and the crews chose to miss and live over aim and burn. The bitter arithmetic shows in the gap between what the doctrine promised and what the night delivered. These men had been handed the most powerful trump card their air defense theory knew, the cover of darkness, and they had been told it made them invisible. And they had believed it the way you believe a thing your whole training rests on. The dark did exactly what it always had. It hid them from eyes. Nobody had told them that eyes were no longer the threat, that the threat read heat and did not care whether the sun was up. And so they took the one advantage they were certain of and carried it like a shield into a fight where it stopped a kind of attack that was not coming. A crew crouched in a wadi, engine ticking as it cooled, tarp pulled tight, listening hard to a sky that gave back nothing but their own breathing. The listening was the cruelest part. You cannot hear a bomb that arrives on a beam of light, and the silence they strained into was not safety. It was the half-second before the flash, stretched out across the whole long winter. The Soviet planners who wrote the air defense doctrine never met the men who broke it, and that gap is the whole story in miniature. They had built a model of the night in offices in Moscow during the 1960s and 70s, a model in which the dark was a wall and the eye was the enemy, and a truck under a tarp was a truck that ceased to exist. They were right about the world they lived in. The trouble was that Pratt and Whitney, Hughes, and Texas Instruments spent the same decades quietly building the world that came next, and nobody in that Moscow office got a vote. The Western Desert settled the question in 6 weeks. American engineers had turned night from an enemy ally into an American working condition, and they had done it not with a single miracle, but with a stack of competent pieces. A navigation pod that drew the ground in heat, a targeting pod that held a laser steady from 4 miles off, a bomb that rode the beam down to a few feet. Each piece was Cold War procurement, line items in budgets fought over in the 1970s, while the doctrine on the other side stood still. I think the deepest irony sits in the word the Soviets prized most: Masklodevka, the whole art of concealment and deception, the camouflage discipline, the engine cuts, the tarps. It worked perfectly against everything except the one sensor that mattered. And it failed not because the crews were sloppy, but because the art itself was aimed at a threat that no longer led the hunt. The Strike Eagle crews flew home to bases in Saudi Arabia, debriefed, slept, and were back on the schedule the next dark cycle, because the Scuds kept coming and the boxes still had to be policed. The launcher crews who survived dispersed deeper, fired less, and waited for a ceasefire that arrived in late February. Between those two facts, the Cold War's military argument was settled in public, in a place the planners on neither side had circled on a map. The desert kept the receipts. South of the Jordanian border, a MAZ-543 transporter sits where the GBU-12 left it. The 8-tire positions burned down to steel rims sunk in sand, the launch rail bent up and back. A recovery team photographed it, logged the grid, and moved on to the next wreck on the list. Somewhere overhead, another F-15E was already turning into its orbit. The pod warm, the desert below it black and full of warm things waiting to be found.